Welcome everybody to the first Afro News Committee discussion. Indeed, Afro News is a new committee among the Afro organization or club. This committee will be in charge of talking about news around the continent, news that are related to economics, politics, and social. And today we're going to have our first discussion, which is related to democracies across the continent. Indeed, this form of discussion is going to be something that's going to be happening throughout the semester, hopefully. And we're going to have also a Afro News format where we're going to be giving major news around the continent. So for the first discussion, we're going to talk about democracies around the continent. In this year, we had a lot of elections across the continent. We had election in Uganda, in the Ivory Coast, in Niger. We had coup d'etat in Mali. We had election in Congo. So today we're going to be talking about those elections and how they unfolded, and we're going to talk about democracy in general across the continent, because it is something that is trending across the continent, and we've seen that a lot of democracies are regressing across the continent and others are progressing. So today we're going to be evaluating and analyzing the state of democracies across the continent. Afro News discussion. Today the topic is going to be around the challenges surrounding democracies on the African continent. So before I start, I want to have like a show of hands on the state of democracies across the continent. So how is Africa doing as a continent in terms of democracy? Good? Bad? Okay? Regressing? Progressing? No change. Okay. So before we continue on the discussion, I want to show a world map of political regime in 2015. It's important to know that by now a lot of those things might have changed, might have got worse or better. But in 2015, something which is interesting, this is the number of countries in Africa that are considered democratic. This is less than half of the continent. And when you go a little bit lower to open anocracy, anocracy is basically a mixture of democracy and dictatorship. Open anocracy, you have this, and closed anocracy, you have that. So the majority of the countries on our continent is either an open anocracy or a closed anocracy. So this is the state in which we are. Now, I'm going to show a second map of the world where in this map you have the number of years of democracy in each country. So when you look at countries that have 1 to 20 years of democracy, you only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 countries. And when you look at for 40 years, you have only 1, 2, 3, 4 countries on the continent that had democracy for 40 years. Then when you look for 60 years, you literally have only 2 countries on the continent. It's important to mention that 60 years before, a lot of the countries in Africa, especially West Africa, were not independent. So they are considered young nations. So my next question is it because we are younger nations that is difficult for us to exercise democracy? That's a discussion question that we can have. Is it because we are a younger nation? Is it difficult for us to exercise democracy? What do you guys think?
Well, I would say so. Because think about if we haven't had enough time as countries, like we have had less time to actually be democracies and to exercise all these democratic things. So I think the fact that we are young as countries, it does play into how we exercise our democracy, and it does affect us. So yeah, I do think so.
Yeah, same. I was thinking the same thing too, because when I look at countries like the United States, we had like 100 years of democracy exercise. They have a really stable democracy, but when I look at in Africa, I don't see any nation that have a stable democracy, and all of them seems to be 60 years old. Like my country is like 62 years old after they got the independence. So there's definitely a correlation there. But I don't know if it's the main reason why democracy is so hard for us to exercise on the continent. Do you think it's the main reason?
Personally, I don't think so. I think the reason it's part of the reason at least. But the problem is like those nations, like at least the United States or France, for that reason, they just made the revolution. You get me? And for us, we're just liberating from from colonization. That transaction for us to go directly, especially that the to go like against most African, at least West Africans, countries that were against France, they rejected anything that France would have proposed. So you are not just starting from the zero; you are starting from below it, because they wanted to make their their culture or their identity part of the democracy that they want to. So most of them, I would say, they just compared it with the era of the colonization, and whatever came up with some were a bit better, and they named it democracy. Which is, it's very hard for us to compare democracy in Africa with democracy in other continents, especially Europe and North America, because the democracy that we aim for, it's way different than the democracy that we idolize or other countries would see. Yeah.
So I personally think that being considered like a young nation is not completely the full thing that explains why Africa is not good or performing good in democracy. But I would kind of try to add on it, like for example, the level of literacy we have in the country. Because why do you get improvement is when you experience from your practice. And being part of, like for example, younger nations, you see like a lot of people or a lot of nations, they don't have like years of experience that they get from the political system that they have. So for them to exercise democracy in full notion, like they lack that experience, because like we have a lot of things happening in Africa right now. Like for example, we talked about dictatorship and stuff. Like we don't have a transition where they can allow people, for example, to exercise free will, or for example, existence of different opinion. Like there's all those people that try to like refrain other people from expressing their opinion. So in that case, I would rather say that because of that, people do lack experience, because like we have a lot of things happening in Africa that doesn't allow us to practice that thing, and we get a lot of experience in order to predict, or for example, try to think what might happen in the future or something like that. So being part of one nation doesn't explain, young nation doesn't explain fully like why we don't perform good in democracy, but rather we don't have experience. We can compare, for example, Africa with the United States. Like most of Africa, like for example, my country is still 7 to 8 years old. Are you thinking that we're gonna perform very good in democracy compared to like United States? No, because we don't have experience here. We didn't face situations that will make us to come with another like ideologies, or for example theories that can make us like to overcome all the challenges that we face in the future. So for Africa, we still need time, and we need like people that can think in order to do very good in democracy. That's how I think.
So as young nations, we have the opportunity to do better than older nations. Do you think we should adopt the same democratic system that all the nations have, like nations like the United States or France, to adopt it back home, or do you think it's not going to be something that is feasible on the continent? Because,
Yeah, I would think that's one of the major reasons that why democracy didn't progress the way that we want to in Africa, especially talking just about my region, like North and West Africa. It's because the influence of other nations, as France as a big example, the influence, like their influence to adapt their democracy is what made it the democracy that we have now. It didn't progress enough because people didn't want it. Like people back home, they didn't want it that way, the way that France have it. But France, like and the other nations, they kept like practicing their influence on those nations, especially because they are young or militarily not strong or economically not independent. It was very easy for them to go for it.
We can try to like adapt like the democracy that other people have, but the main problem is like in Africa you just have a small minority that know actually what democracy is. Like not everyone know what democracy is. So if you have something like that in Africa, you have those small group of minority that try to influence the democracy in their own way because they want to do it in the system that can literally bring benefit back to them. What about the other people? They don't know what democracy is. There's high level of literacy that we have in Africa, that we have in Africa, that people doesn't know what kind of political system they're actually trying to adopt to. So democracy itself, like I think most countries, especially countries that for example, that got independence late in Africa, like a lot of people, you just have a group of minority that actually know what defines democracy, but the other people were just like, it's just like they are victims of, for example, all those kind of political manipulations that those small minorities that give to them.
So, based on how the discussion is going, I feel like we're all kind of agreeing that Africans are lacking democratic education, because I remember I didn't have a curriculum back home that talked about politics or democracies in my country. We just brushed on it and yeah. So do you think that if countries start teaching the practice of democracy and politics in school, is going to get people better equipped to exercise it?
I think so. I will give you an example. Like, for example, in my country, South Sudan is not stable. We have like fighting and stuff. So when the government decided to, for example, come with another political system that will ensure that there is no clash between the government parties, what they did is they introduced the idea of, for example, federalism. But when they introduced this idea, immediately people start jumping up. No, we don't want federalism because you're going to divide us. We don't want division and stuff. Like people don't know actually what the term is, but they rather want to work with all their kind of dogmatic religious belief that they think is work for them, because they think adopting other, cultures or, for example, democracy from other countries is trying to like take away the form of belief or cultural values that they do practice. That's how I think about it. Because like, if you want like literally people in Africa to practice democracy very well, I think education will be very good, because if people actually know what democracy is, then we can practice it really good.
Other thought?
No, I also really think that having certain courses in school will be very impactful and beneficial, because, for example, I live in 2 different countries, and I did my elementary school in Benin, and I don't remember myself having like courses like teaching me like the exercise of democracy like in the country. We rushed into it. We talked about like how the politics works, like the parties, but we didn't really like get to learn like what the democracy is, how to exercise it. And I feel like by having education on such topics, you will eventually end up exercising in the future. So it will be beneficial and impactful, and then more people will practice it. And I also think that democracy has very been like challenged and also influenced by other democracies. For example, like I don't know about all Western African countries, but I know that most of them at least have been impacted or influenced by the French democracy, like most of it, like how it works and how like it is exercised. I feel like I feel like education will be great also like in this various topics.
Amazing. Another thought.
I was gonna say, I do think that education is very important in how Africa can exercise democracy, because it's hard to exercise something you don't know. However, I think in adopting democracy, it still has to be adapted itself to African countries, because when you just try and adopt this Western concept and you don't take into consideration where you are, like that's not gonna really work, because you're gonna want to try and be like France, you're gonna want to be like the US, but the conditions in the US and in France are so different to the conditions we have. And so when you mentioned like how people